Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final day of the Fort Collins Book Fest this year. It's been a pleasure all the way around, and I am delighted to be tuned in with you and to have James Bridle joining us for this session. My name is Joseph Braun. I am the curator, proprietor, etc. of Perelandra Bookshop at Wolverine Farm Public House, which is a literary haven and what we call a watering hole here in Fort Collins. I really am over the moon to welcome and introduce you to James Bridle and to attend to his work, to their work today. I wanted to be sure to mention that there will be time to ask a few questions at the end, so definitely feel free to do this, ask away when the time comes in the live stream comments. Before we get started, I want to thank a few of the festival sponsors which make this possible free of charge for our community and this extended community and conversation over the waves, so to speak. The Book Fest is produced by the Poudre River Public Library District, with presenting sponsorship by the City of Fort Collins Fort Fund and Colorado State University Libraries. Further support from Wolverine Farm Publishing and Public House, the Lilla B. Morgan Endowment Fund, Downtown Development Authority, and Colorado Creative Industries, and our wonderful media partners, KUNC and 105.5 Colorado Sound. All gratitude to everyone above. Let's get to it. The sheer volume of information available to us today, James Bridle writes, reveals less than we hope. Rather, it heralds a new dark age, a world of ever-increasing incomprehension. To support this conclusion, or really problem of continuation, Bridle points not only to the obvious precarity of overarching epistemologies of governance and culture, the visible newsworthy conflicts of culture wars, systematic failures in social justice, public health care, law enforcement, employment, etc., but to specific travesties borne by human systems that have been methodically entrusted decisions to the pure, quote unquote, pure logic of big data. Quantified thinking, Bridle writes, is the dominant ideology of contemporary life, not just in scientific and computational domains, but in government policy, social relations, and individual identity. It exists equally in qualified research and subconscious instinct, in the calculations of economic austerity and the determinacy of social media. More information does not produce more truth, it endangers it. What comes to mind for me is we hear the skeleton of enlightenment knocking on the postmodern closet door. And again, I quote James in saying, no process is dispassionate or separate from psychological and social influence. And so quantified thinking inevitably fails. What I find most encouraging, James, about your work is the sense of what you refer to as systematic literacy, or understanding that comes from any number of directions, understanding, in your words, that literacy is transferable and that we all have the capabilities to apply it to think clearly about subjects that seem difficult and complex. We all, in our own way, have the capacity to make meaning, I think, is the fundamental point. And then with special reference to the Book Fest, a celebration for which the book or the idea of books, the history and future of books is central. James's inquiries and experiments trace many a line back through the act of book publishing. So I would ask how many of us here, or wherever you are at the Book Fest, like James, wrote, illustrated, and made books in our childhood. And I'd wager most of us. And these probably stuffed into the servers of family closets, part of that processor of time itself. So James's artworks have been commissioned by galleries and institutions and exhibited worldwide on the internet, and their writing on literature, culture, and networks has appeared in publications including Wired, The Atlantic, New Statesman, The Guardian, and many others. New Dark Age itself was published by Verso in 2018, and it is a true delight, James, to welcome you and thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. It's really nice to be here. Shall I go? Shall I go? Shall I start my presentation? Shall I start my presentation?
Excellent. Yes, most definitely. Of course.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thanks to everyone who's making this possible, and very nice to speak to you all. I am going to talk for a little while about some of the themes of this book, New Dark Age. When this works, in a second. There we go. Which, as you've heard, is a book that came out a couple of years ago, but it was really the result of over a decade of thinking about a number of questions about society and politics that, for me, crystallized around questions of technology. As someone born in 1980 and online since the early 90s, I sort of consider myself to have grown up with the internet to some extent. I'm in that interesting cohort that, saw the internet in its very earliest stages, belonged indeed to certain communities that had very utopian ideas of what this technology would bring, and have since, it's somewhat regretted some of our enthusiasm. But nevertheless, I've worked in technology as a programmer, as a coder, and I've worked as a publisher, and I work as an artist. And in many, many ways, I engage with these technologies all the time, as we all do. And they're not going away. So I tend to end up thinking about them quite a lot. Excuse me. And at the heart of that thinking, really, is the thing that kind of recurs all the time, is thinking about this thing that kind of sits at the heart of contemporary society, and at the heart of all of our ideas about not just technology, but network technology. So the fact that, these machines that we engage with all the time, that run through all of our society, are all joined together in some way, form some kind of overarching sphere of life that we call the cloud, that we give this incredibly kind of nebulous name to something that we feel shadows our lives, and really does shadow our lives in all these ways. And yet we seem incapable of really describing it, or talking about it clearly, or understanding what it means. And so a lot of my work is kind of thinking these questions through, trying to understand what the cloud is, what the machines are doing all the time, but really, more importantly, what their impact on our lives are. Because one of the greatest sort of realizations I had writing this book, which was an attempt for myself to kind of come to terms with what I saw as the problems being caused by technology, was this realization that technology is also a way that we think, that we've become so accustomed to using these technologies. They've become such an embedded part of our daily lives and our societies that they're seated quite deeply in our brains. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how that came to be, and kind of maybe what it's doing to us. Yeah. So one of the places that I like to think this started is with the weather. I'm British, so everything's about the weather ultimately. But I can justify it a little. One of my personal heroes is a guy called Lewis Fry Richardson, who was a British meteorologist. He studied the weather. And he studied it as meteorologists did at the beginning of the 20th century, by kind of staring at the sky and watching what it did. But he kind of decided, or he realized that maybe you could understand more about the weather by taking a kind of much bigger view of it than what you could see in the sky above you. That you could start to see it as a kind of system, and that you could see it as a global system. And he thought it would be interesting to study this. So in the years before the First World War, he started to think about how you could gather data about it, about how you could use things like the telegraph to collect information about distant points. And if you had enough information about it, then perhaps you could run some kind of mathematical calculation on it. You could take the kind of variables of temperature and pressure and so on, and perform a kind of mathematical calculation on these data points, and actually predict what might happen in the future. And the First World War somewhat intervened in this. Richardson was a Quaker, so he was also a pacifist. So he refused to fight, but he joined an ambulance unit, as many Quakers did. And so he was present on the front lines of many of the biggest battles of the First World War. But he took with him a collection of weather data. He actually had a complete set of European weather data for one day in May from 1912. And while behind front lines, between breaks on the ambulance route, sometimes even under shell fire, with pencil and paper, he kept making these calculations. And at a certain point during the war, after many months of work, he actually performed the first 24-hour weather forecast, i.e. he took all of that data he gathered, he did his maths on it, and he used that data to predict the weather reasonably accurately. There were a lot of mistakes in there, but if you look back, he did a pretty good job, considering he was only working with pencil and paper. And in fact, at that time, performing a 24-hour weather forecast took him something like 6 months, which isn't really incredibly helpful. But for Richardson and for us, this is an amazing achievement. He never thought it would really actually be practically useful, but in developing this method, he did this thing that you see in this slide of dividing the world up into these little boxes and turning the world into data, transforming the real huge effects of the climate, this kind of processes of constant chaotic change, into something to be put into little boxes and therefore operated on mathematically. This realization that the world could be broken down into little bits of data, and that this data represented some form of truth. And not only that data represented truth, but then mathematical calculations performed on that data produced another kind of truth, a prediction that was inseparable from the real world itself. As I said, this took Richardson some months, and he didn't really believe that there would ever be enough people with pieces of paper in order to make this fast enough to be realistic, but he didn't predict the development of digital computers. And this is the program that was first used in 1946 to perform the first 24-hour weather forecast, in this case for North America, that actually ran faster. That they actually completed this operation in 23.5 hours. So they beat the world by half an hour. It took 25 years on from Richardson's work and the development of digital computers to prove his method of breaking the world down into little squares and performing operations on the data, that you could run a computer faster than the world itself. And therefore you could predict the future, or one version of the future that seemed pretty believable and believable enough to shift people's behavior, right? Because that's what we do with the weather forecasts. We look at them and we change our behavior in response to what is a mathematical calculation of the world. It's not the world, but if we do it well enough, it seems almost indistinguishable from it. And this is an extraordinary ability, and it's one that is not just, as we know, being used for the weather, but now increasingly takes almost every part of life, that we're engaged in these systems of kind of datafication and calculation that shape our lives and shape our behaviors in all kinds of ways. And this is the history of the development of computation and of network computers over the last 100 or so years. This is the computer that did that first calculation. It was called the Eniac, and it was constructed with US Army and other funding during the Second World War. For multiple purposes, but its two main uses by the end of the war were calculating the weather and calculating the efficiency of nuclear bombs, which also required the same kind of very intense levels of calculation. And so right at the beginning of this technological processing of everyday life, you have the seed of kind of warfare and violence inherent in it, which I think is very significant. But just to take a moment to look at this extraordinary machine, because you may be familiar with machines like this from old pictures, but we're not familiar with them anymore. This is a computer that took up a couple of rooms. We call them mainframes. And everything you see in this room, and in fact another room next to it, is the same computer. And it's all the parts of contemporary computation. They're all present here, but they're bigger, essentially. They've kind of exploded across this room. And there's a couple of, I think, really interesting things about this. The first is that it produces a kind of illusion when we look at historical photos like this, that that this isn't that everything kind of reduced from here and became more powerful or essentially smaller. There's a beautiful quote from an engineer called Harry Reid, who worked on this computer, who said, what was wonderful about the Eniac was that it was a very personal computer. And of course, now we think of a personal computer as something, a laptop, something you can carry around with you. But the Eniac was a personal computer because you lived inside it. It was a kind of architecture, right? Which is a beautiful image, but it's also, I think, fundamentally wrong, because we have this belief that everything concentrated down. But of course, what happened actually was that the computer spread across the globe. That we've now created this kind of globe of computation that surrounds us. That runs kind of in cables under the ocean into huge buildings filled with computers and servers that run social media and everything else, that even extends up into space in satellites. So really, we all live inside this kind of architecture of computation that Harry Reid described. And the second thing that's amazing about this is if you knew what this computer was doing, you could kind of stand inside this room and you could watch computation happen around you. You could kind of watch the calculations as they flowed from device to device around the room. You could see the kind of lights coming off. You could even hear the sound of the thing kind of working, vibrating. And so computation was very legible. You were kind of aware that it was going on around you. But of course, this is what computation looks like now. It looks like these little black mirrors, to use the now famous phrase from the TV series. They look like these little black boxes, of which none of that operation is visible. Unless you're very highly skilled or have some very specialized knowledge, you have no idea what's going on inside this thing. And yet this thing and all the other devices that are, all around the world like it in various forms are so entrenched in our everyday life. And yet for most of us, they remain completely inaccessible. And that's a terrifying problem, because they've only got more powerful. This is a graph of what's known as Moore's law. This was coined in the early 70s by a man called Moore, who worked at Intel, who make the chips. And he looked at what was happening with chips, and he thought that, they're going to keep on getting better. And he thought that over the next decade or two, they would double in power every 2 years. That was his prediction. It was just a kind of rule of thumb, but it's held true ever since. It's a rule of thumb that kind of became a law that got named after him, Moore's law. Computers would keep on getting more powerful. This graph would keep on going up and to the right. And it's also become a kind of moral law, right? It's become something that we believe in, that we think is right, and creates this kind of excess in the future. We know we will always have more power to do what we need to do in the future. Which feels a lot like a lot of our other illusions, the illusion of kind of fossil fuels and extraction that have powered society for the last couple of centuries, but we're starting to realize are actually hugely damaging. But even this idea of the power of computing to kind of improve information, the quality of information, or just to improve what we know, doesn't always hold true. This is a graph that doesn't go up and to the right. In fact, it mirrors Moore's law so directly in the opposite direction that it's come to be known as Eroom's law, which is Moore's law backwards. And this is a graph of the number of drugs discovered, new discoveries in pharmacology against the amount of kind of money going into research. And it also maps the development of computers, the fact that we now use computers for scientific discovery in the same way. And what we're discovering across multiple scientific fields is that applying more and more computation to knowledge production, to discovery, actually is producing fewer and fewer results. That we seem to have got ourselves into some little box where we only have one tool, which is the computer, to kind of think new thoughts, and the results are starting to tail off quite seriously. That's not the only result, of course. I mentioned the effects on the climate of this belief in computation, and of course we know that this is actually becoming a greater and greater problem. The energy output, the kind of CO2 and other emissions from computation are vast. The internet itself, and the internet, not your computer at home, but just the servers that run everything you connect with, have about the same carbon footprint as the airline industry. These graphs here show something that I became deeply kind of fascinated in, which is the increase in turbulence on long-haul flights caused by rises in CO2 in the atmosphere. So if you're lucky enough to live in a place which hasn't felt the impact of climate change yet, which is fewer and fewer, one of the places it is felt is on planes, which are getting bumpier, because as the atmosphere warms, as the air gets hotter, it's increasing the pressure and speed differentials between between layers of the air. And so one of the places that climate change is being most noted by people in the northern hemisphere is that flights are getting bumpier. This is the real cloud that is emitted from our clouds of computation, that we're changing the very constituent parts of the atmosphere, and the future is getting much more bumpy. That's not the only thing that climate change is doing or potentially doing. This is the other graph that goes up into the right. This is the what's called the Keeling Curve. It's the amount of CO2 measured in the atmosphere every year. That's been increasing since the beginning of industrial times, but is increasing massively as a result of contemporary society, fossil fuel use, and as I said, the use of computation itself. The more information we put through computers, the more CO2 we put out. And that's bad for the environment, but it's also directly bad for us. One of the things that's lesser known about the effects of carbon dioxide is it actually makes it harder to think. They've tested this by, for example, measuring the difference between opening and closing windows in kind of schoolrooms, or measuring students after they've slept in rooms with the windows closed all night. And a measurable increase of CO2, if you have 1,000 parts per million, which we're at about half of in the atmosphere, but you regularly get inside a classroom without the windows open, cognitive performance drops by 20%. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere literally makes it harder to think. So at the same time as we're diverting all this thinking into machines, we're turning the atmosphere into something that makes it harder for humans to think at all. And all of this weird stuff seems to me to be connected to this, towards our difficulty of thinking. There's a term that was invented by park rangers in the United States, possibly not too far from where some of you are sitting, which they call death by GPS. And this is what happens, they discovered, when drivers would follow the bright line of their sat-nav systems into places that were inhospitable to life, into places like Death Valley, or in some cases even into rivers and lakes, because we've become so accustomed to trusting the advice of machines around us that people would ignore the evidence of their own senses. They would look out the window and say, oh, it's getting a bit hot, or it's getting a bit wet, but you know, the GPS says it's fine, so we'll just carry on down this line. And there have been multiple cases of people dying or being seriously injured because they would rather trust the advice of the GPS system over the advice of their own senses. And it's really important to note that this isn't, as tragic and occasionally funny as that situation is, it's really important to note it's not like stupid people doing this. It's not just a dumb thing. They put like pilots inside simulation tests. People who have tens of thousands of hours of flight experience. Some of the most kind of specialized people are very familiar with these systems. And they've tested them by putting them through simulated disasters. And at one particular moment, programming the simulator to give them bad advice. And 99% of the time, however highly trained people are, they will follow that advice over the advice of all of their senses, even with all that training. And psychologists call this automation bias. There's basically something in our brain that the brain likes to take shortcuts, essentially. And when presented with a shortcut, like a computer telling you what to do, the brain says, yes, do that instead. We're incredibly susceptible to this advice. But we're also building into our society. This is a picture of an Amazon warehouse. This is a picture of the largest one in Europe, which is in Rugeley in the UK. There's something really extraordinary about this space to me, which is this is not a space which humans can understand. Everything that Amazon sells is in this space, but you would never be able to find it because Amazon discovered that it's more efficient to organize everything in this space according to how frequently it is needed. So they have an algorithm that runs through everything and they store everything like that. So it's not all the books in alphabetical order and then all the CDs, DVDs, whatever over here, and then cleaning products over there. Everything is mixed up together. And in order to navigate that space, humans have to use a computer, like their own little personal GPS, to move around this space in order to be able to find it. This is a space that's designed for computers, not for humans. But humans are still inside this space, right? Humans are still in there walking miles and miles every day, suffering bad backs and bad knees and climbing over things. And those devices that they're using also do things like monitor their bathroom breaks and make sure they are keeping to their time, monitoring their overtime, checking even how long they spend talking to other colleagues. And so along with this kind of datafication and this control of human behavior, you also get this kind of surveillance and this power over them. And you get very strange things happening as a result of a system that's optimized for the machines rather than people. These are what are known as dark kitchens. They're essentially fake restaurants that are set up with some poor person in there slaving over a stove, pretending to be a full restaurant in order to service delivery apps, and then placed in the useful locations around cities, so that people who are at home believe they're ordering from some lovely restaurant, but they're actually ordering, someone who's boiled something in a bag in a container under an overpass. And so becomes this kind of separation of what the world that we think we're living in and who we think we're connecting to and everyday life. One of my favorite examples of this actually is Pokemon Go, which is it was a huge fact that sent tens of thousands, probably millions of people out into the street, again, with their personal GPS devices, essentially, following this line to go and find their Pokemon. What most people weren't aware of is that before releasing the game, Nintendo and Niantic, the people who made it, sold the locations of all of the best features, the best Pokemon, and the places you had to go to large corporations. So it's no surprise that when you're out in the street looking for Pokemon, you find yourself repeatedly running in front of a Starbucks or a McDonald's and so on and so forth. That you are actually being directed literally through the streets, walk into kind of shopping centers and shops without any of your knowledge, but being kind of directed through this personal GPS device that through automation bias and your own interests kind of has taken over your path through the city. And we know this is happening with knowledge and understanding as well. This is a particularly disturbing example for me because this was something that I found myself and sort of encountered. This is a screen grab of YouTube, and on the left you have a recording of Walter Cronkite on a newscast in 1980 talking about climate change. Quite early to be talking about it, but it's very clear what he's talking about. He's talking about the research, the relationship between burning fossil fuels, the warming of the atmosphere, how dangerous this is, and how we should probably pay attention to it. CBS nightly broadcast. On the right is everything you think that YouTube/Google thinks you should watch next, which is a series of climate denialists, of kind of absolutely anti-scientific and irresponsible attempts to persuade you against something that was evident to people who were talking clearly about it in 1980. It's a real example of the ways in which we have gone backwards and the role in which our kind of automation bias and the technology drives this. Because Google probably, I think, believes in climate change, whether it wants to do anything about it or not. But they have inadvertently built a system that makes money out of persuading people that it doesn't exist. And they didn't even mean to do that. That's just what's really scary. Like, they built a computer system that's designed to show people what people would like to watch next. And it turns out what people want to watch next is something that is sensationalist, is controversial, seems to go against the grain. And so what we're doing is we've trained the computer system to try and dissuade us away from information that might actually save our life. And some people are making huge amounts of money out of doing that, of course. The weird effects of this just promulgate. There was a website called Ashley Madison, which was a dating website for people who wanted to have affairs, and it was hacked a few years ago, and the hackers released all the data, and what they discovered was that 95% of the members were men, or listed as men, and less than 5% were listed as women. And when they looked at the accounts of those women, they discovered that actually all of those women were bots. They were robots. There were basically no women involved at all. There was just huge numbers of men paying for membership of this site in order to have conversations with people they wanted to believe were women, but were in fact very, very simple chatbots. And so I don't know where the illusion is at play there, right? But there was a complete breakdown in what we're even capable of believing when certain incentives are placed in front of it. And it's not just like crap dating sites. This has become political policy. In recent years, we've learned huge amounts about the way in which this is used politically. This is a shot of a building belonging to a company that became known as the Internet Research Agency, which is a Moscow-funded what's called a troll farm, a whole building full of people going on the internet in order to do the same stuff YouTube is doing, to dissuade people. And we heard a lot about this in various US and European elections, that this was some kind of sinister plot by Moscow, which it was, but as though they were trying to sort of persuade us all to like Russia or something like that. But that's not what was happening. What they were trying to do was confuse us. What they had realized was that actually the internet was such a sort of dirty and confusing place that what the way in which you do politics today and the way you increase your own power is actually just to confuse people. So they funded opposition groups, people with different views themselves. They funded and created fake Black Lives Matter groups, for example, that genuinely campaigned for Black Lives Matter. But they also created conservative groups that opposed it. And they fed both of these things to make the internet more of an unpleasant place, and basically to make it more confusing so you had no idea what was going on all the time. And it's not just people doing this either, it's also the technologies that were generated. This is one of my favorite examples. This is an example from Google's phone. So if you've got an Android phone, you may have noticed that sometimes it kind of edits your photographs that you're taking. And it usually does this to make the lighting better or get rid of photos where someone blinked or something. Our phones, as I'm sure you're aware, are actually incredibly sophisticated computers. And they're doing all of this weird stuff in the background. And this happened to someone called Robert Smith, who's the gentleman in the photos, who's actually an AI researcher. And he realized he'd taken 2 photos of himself with his wife. Those are the 2 photos on the left. And in one of them, he's smiling and she's not. And the other one, he's smiling and she's not. I got that right. And he realized that the computer, his own phone, had generated a 3rd photo. He'd composited the 2 photos to create a photo where they were both smiling, which is a lovely idea. But what they had done was created a photo of a moment that never existed. They'd invented a moment that becomes a memory, right? That then becomes something that we believe in. And yet, at the simplest level of the photos on your app, this kind of whole bizarre, non-existent world is coming into being. All of these are photos of people who don't exist. This is where huge amounts of kind of AI and Facebook and Google's and all their other research goes into, is to create believable images, essentially, of things that don't exist. And the results, for me, increasingly, of this situation, of all of these situations, right? From interacting with technology that we don't understand, to that technology doing things to us that we're not aware of, whether it's driving us through driving us to shops that we didn't know we were meant to be going to, or whether it's shaping our kind of daily labor, like the Amazon workers, whether it's kind of muddying our politics, so it's just unclear who anyone is on the playing field, or whether it's presenting us with a reality that simply doesn't correspond to the actual world. This, for me, underlies really the confusion that the world we find ourselves in today. I started writing this book, New Dark Age, with this central question in mind. Why, given all of the information that we supposedly have access to, given our kind of Enlightenment belief that access to more information makes us smarter, right? That leads us to be able to make better decisions. Well, we've got all that information, and yet we seem to be living in a world that is ever more divided, ever more confused, ever more crucially broken down into fundamentalist oppositional situations, where instead of kind of coming together into some kind of agreement about issues, we're actually being driven more and more to extremes in every direction. And that to me is fundamental to thinking about this thing called the cloud. And perhaps we'll discuss this a bit more in the Q&A, because I've kind of laid the groundwork for it. But it's my real understanding now, and my sort of belief that there's something, as you heard, fundamentally amiss in the ways that we're using and making technology. But there's also something fundamentally amiss in the way that we understand the world. Because of all this technology was supposed to create this kind of clearer view and understanding, but instead what we have made is the cloud, right? We've created something at the heart of society and politics and global life that is in fact cloudy, that's knotty and complex and disturbing. And the lesson of that is that actually, well, maybe that is quite a good model of the world if we actually choose to take it seriously. The world itself is complex and disturbing and strange and contains all kinds of contradictions that don't fit neatly into little boxes. And so the problem of the world is not that it needs to be kind of ironed out into this flat surface, that it needs to be fed into little database boxes, but really it needs to be understood as something that is always going to be more complex than we can get our heads around. And that for me is a starting point of starting to think differently about how we think about and interact with the world and with each other, how we build technology on the one hand, but really how we think about the world itself as something that is infinitely more interesting and complex than our technologies would have us believe. And if we can start to regain a little bit of that sense of kind of complexity, but of wonder in complexity, of being interested in that complexity, then actually I think we have the chance to start seeing the world a little anew and afresh. Thank you very much. And let's have a chat.
James, thank you so much. The mind is pulled in hundreds, thousands, millions of different directions, and yet it is still the mind, and we're sharing it and we have it. I would like to encourage folks listening in immediate response to the cloud, unto the cloud that James has led us through, to inquire in the chat. I do already have a couple of questions, James, to introduce. Please, everyone, don't hesitate. We do have roughly 15 minutes to entertain some questions. So, James, the first question has to do with reaction to negative versus positive content and how that is leveraged. And of course, content is a tricky thought. Where is the content in all that you spoke to, whether it's stepping into the computer that is the room of computation versus holding it in your hand? But simply put, the question is if psychology shows we tend to react and engage with content that is more negative, is there an algorithmic solution that could be sort of equally profitable, that would prioritize positive content? And curious to know what you say.
I mean, it's possible to build systems that would promote such content, absolutely. I fear, however, it would not be profitable. And I think that's in some way that's quite clear from the systems that have essentially evolved, because I really meant it when I said, using the YouTube example, that whatever I personally think of them, I don't believe the people who work at YouTube and Google set out to kind of poison the well of knowledge and politics in the way that they have. But they genuinely believe that that by creating something that they perceive to be neutral, they would create something that would itself behave neutrally.
Mm.
But of course, there was no neutrality because they were seeking to profit from it. And in doing so, they were seeking to have a kind of power relationship with the audience. They were seeking to extract money out of this system. And in doing that, you've already set up a power relationship between the company and the people who pay it, between the website and the viewers, that is fundamentally unequal. So there's an inequality that's built into that system, which is also exacerbated by the kind of opacity of that system, that people don't really understand how it functions. And really, out of that inequality, for me, you're always going to get these incredibly negative outcomes as soon as that inequality is introduced. And within capitalist systems, it's incredibly hard not to introduce those inequalities. There are models that exist within systems of exchange and value that are more equal by design, but they are certainly in contemporary society incredibly difficult to scale, and they're also very, very unattractive to shareholders. So there's a fundamental problem with the idea that you could financially compete in a system like this, because the financial incentives are always going to outweigh the social one. YouTube should be shut down. Facebook should be nationalized, if not shut down. If we genuinely want them to perform social goods, there's kind of no other real way out of that for me. But we know from the history of many other industries that it's not purely social interest that drives these things.
Mm-hmm. Kurt Vonnegut's Player Piano comes to mind, and other dystopian, what are referred to as dystopian fictions, but are coming straight out of experience. I am thinking as well, we had a painter recently here in Fort Collins participating in a panel who said that every time he hears creativity or art mentioned in a question, he wonders if he's in a business meeting. And these conceptions, I think, as far as finding positive solutions, I know you as an artist, the conflation in Pokemon Go, for example, of what the investment, what's underlying the created product in the first place. Is, how separated are the two? I will lead right into the next question. How, which is pretty straightforward. How do we as individuals or together prevent automation bias as you describe it? And what does prevention of something like that, so deeply psychological, entail?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is always education, like bottom line. I mean, you can change your personal habits for sure. Like, you can not use the things that rely on these as triggers, essentially, and that's a choice that we all have. You can simply step away from them. It's not easy to do in contemporary society, but it remains entirely possible. And you can simply re-engage and start paying, a different form of attention to the world around you. And by becoming aware of it in the first place, it becomes something that you're capable of questioning. But for me, the roots of that go a little bit deeper. And the thing that I'm usually most interested in addressing in my own work is the layers of kind of opacity that allow these systems to work in the way that they do. So it's not just being aware of what's happening in the moment, it's being aware of kind of the structure of the whole system. And what I talk about in the book quite a lot is what I call kind of technological literacy, um, which can be as simple as just understanding how computers work, but also goes into all other kinds of literacy in terms of understanding how profiting, how profit works and how corporations
Mm.
structure themselves in order to build the things that they do. Or it's education pure and simple. But as an artist, personally, I find the best way to address these systems is to have this really good understanding of how they work, and also to be able to play with them or consider alternatives in the way they can be constructed. So an example I think is useful from my own work is that a few years ago I set out to build a self-driving car, right? Which is these things that are becoming more common now, but still have this kind of weird science fiction aura about them. Um, they're also, on the one hand, like the ultimate example of the kind of the GPS tendency. Not only are you like, is the car deciding where to go, it's literally driving you there. Like you're completely sitting back and handing over all control to a vehicle, punching in your destination and sitting back. But so when I designed and programmed the self-driving car, my self-driving car actually didn't do that. It did the driving, but it didn't make the decisions of where to go. In fact, what it did was it drove at random, right? So I programmed it to basically take the next, like, left, right, whatever came along. I programmed it to get lost, essentially.
Mm.
That changed the nature of the journey that I was on fundamentally. And instead of the computer, which is the car, becoming a kind of master of that journey, it actually became a kind of a fellow explorer
Mm.
that allowed me to actually go to places that were less expected, that also made me more interested and pay attention and so on and so forth. Now, we don't always want to get lost. We don't always want to follow the most random route. But by learning about how the machine worked, I was able to like envisage these kind of different possibilities for it that changed my own awareness of it, but also changed like how it's possible to even talk about the thing and propose these kind of alternatives for how it might work.
Yes.
Which is a long-winded way of also replying to one thing in your question is like, I don't really believe, and I'm very clear on this in the book, don't really believe in solutions to this. In fact, I consider the whole kind of notion of like problems and solutions of how there being a fixed relationship between those things as being like another result of using computers too much. Right?
Yeah.
That we think these are things that can be neatly framed, and then you make another app, and then it's the answer to it, and you're stuck in the same loop again. It's an ongoing process of figuring those things out and relating and kind of changing behaviors. Um, but again, in choosing to actively participate in that, one is oneself changed from being a kind of passive recipient of information or a passive user of machines into someone who has agency in this situation and is more capable of making one's own decisions.
Yes. Yeah. Taking things apart, putting them back together again. Um, we have time for a couple, probably two more questions, I think. And also the automated vehicle as a situationist exercise is what it sounds like. It's wonderful. So from Annie, do you see, this is another fairly direct question with poetic potential. Do you see any light in the new dark age? Do you feel the expansion of globalization and so-called interconnectivity is advantageous to our survival in any way whatsoever?
Yeah, this is a hard one, and certainly while writing the book, I struggled to find that light. But there's a couple of things I'd say. The first thing is the darkness of the New Dark Age is not like a horrible blackness, right?
Mhm.
I fairly early on in the book, I think I tried to be quite clear in saying that the dark can be an interesting, even exciting place to be.
Mhm.
And it should remind us that we do live in a world of complexity and critically of uncertainty, that is a reminder to kind of resist the illusion of mastery and dominance. So I don't want to live in the kind of bright white, optimistic, everything is clear world, because actually that's the world of kind of computational certainty and of kind of total submission to this belief in kind of one unifying truth that the computers produce. I'm happy living in the darkness. So for me, actually, the new dark age itself is not entirely a bad thing if we take it seriously for what it means.
Yeah.
But to answer the second half of that question as well, like I'm not, as much as I can sound like it sometimes, I'm aware, a sort of anti purely technology in itself. The very famous old quote is that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it ever neutral. It's just another variable kind of inside the systems. And most people who are alive today are alive as a result of technology, and most people will go on living with its help. And it does extraordinary things. And I think a really good example of this is in our reactions to climate change. We are aware of what is happening in the world. As much as it is caused by some aspects of technology, we're also aware of it because of technology. We have this, particularly this kind of extraordinary global view, this kind of God's eye view on the world, which is created through satellite technologies, through viewing technologies, but also through our ability to kind of gather data. There's no like backing out of the situation that we find ourselves in now. We're utterly enmeshed with these technologies. And we have to choose what to do with it. You know, one of my really favorite examples of this is that a few years ago, one of the directors at NASA got a phone call from, turned out to be from the National Geospatial Agency. The National Geospatial Agency is like, is one of the biggest secret kind of spy agencies in the US, along with the CIA and NSA. They're the people who are responsible for watching us from space. So they build all the satellites, the secret satellites that are going around and looking at the Earth. This guy at NASA got a call from one of them going like, we've got a couple of satellites going spare. Do you want one? It was a little bit hush hush, and they kind of removed a lot of the stuff from it. But it turned out this super secret spy agency had two incredibly high tech satellites surplus to requirements, and it donated them to NASA. And these are, for the spy agency, these are like 20-year-old technologies. For NASA, they were some of the most extraordinary high-tech stuff they'd ever seen, which is a whole other massive problem and another discussion. But what NASA are now doing is they're repurposing those satellites, and one of them is going to become what's called WFIRST. It's going to become a new space observation satellite. It's going to look for new planets. It's going to observe like the kind of cosmic background radiation. It's going to do some really amazing science. It's the same piece of equipment, right? But instead of being pointed down and used as part of a power relation for spying on people, it's literally being turned around to look out at the universe so that we may learn more about our place in it. Like technology has the total capacity to be used for the things that whatever it is we want to use it for. Yeah. And the thing to be really thought carefully about is not the technology itself. It's all of these power relations, who's in charge of it, who owns it, who understands how it works, what happens when we decide that maybe we'd like other people to have more power in that relationship. And particularly, I think, critically, this loops back to the education thing, more people who understand it. Because we need more people thinking about what we can do with it. And more people can only do it. The greatest kind of diversity of minds can only be brought to bear when more and more people understand, what these systems are actually doing. So it's an argument for education, both kind of for like reusing the thing, but also it's just a really kind of much broader social good that also then loops around to kind of benefit us all in the long run.
Yes. Yeah. I have a friend who's a friend and a marvelous poet who's fond of saying, whichever way your face is pointing, that must be what you're looking at. We I think have time for probably one more question, and I hope that we're not going to disappoint too many folks here, but questions continue as ever. So let's see here if I can synthesize this appropriately for you, James. Were there moments, people, or key developments that led us here? And certainly you touched on some of this in your in the talk and visuals. Or do you see our present moment as something evolutionary per se, inevitable as soon as computation was unleashed. And then there's a little clarification: could or should it have happened another way? And then I think we're back in the idea of solutionism. But nevertheless,
Yeah, I mean, there's many different ways of telling this story, of course, and it depends what kind of historian you are. You can do a kind of great man history of technology, because the nature of history is it tends to be mostly men, and you could start an argument about why that's messed up as one of your starting points. You can also tell a Marxist history of the development of technology, and you can tell a kind of chaotic one, which is the one I fairly subscribe to, which is that very no one planned where we were going to be now. Various things were invented. I sometimes refer to. I like to think of the internet. I sometimes call the internet an unconsciously generated machine for unconscious generation, by which I mean that no one designed the internet. No one created this kind of vast architecture, which is the greatest kind of human invention since language. No one consciously set out to create it. It kind of built up, and it is itself a tool for kind of creation and generation, right? Which makes it completely extraordinary. So that is critically different from something being inevitable, because of course, it being so chaotic and kind of coming up from these sources, it also could have come up, hugely many different ways. We've hooked together so many little bits and pieces, and actually, in New Dark Age, I pick out some of these moments that seem to me to be significant. For example, the use of this kind of history of weather forecasting is one of the strong threads of this. But you can use the same approach to tell many stories. And in fact, in my new book, which attempts to chart a slightly more optimistic process out of this, the process is related in that I go back through certain parts of kind of computational history, and I look for moments when things could have been done differently. So a couple of my favorite examples of that, the stories I would tell in the new book, when Alan Turing invented the computer, essentially, or kind of wrote the blueprint for what became every single modern computer back in the 1940s, he actually described two computers. He described something he called the automated machine, which we know as the Turing machine, which is basically every single computer that we have today, which are computers that step through a series of pre-programmed decisions that are essentially just algorithms, are just step-by-step processes for doing a calculation, coming to a decision. That's what we have. But in the same paper in 1943, I might have that date wrong, he also described something he called an oracle machine, or a choice machine, which would not operate like this. That would operate entirely differently. It would not operate by step-by-step processes. And in a little footnote, he says, I will not describe the choice machine further except to say that it cannot be a machine. And then he goes back to digital computers, and we have the whole next 75 years of computation. But right at the beginning of the computation, there's a possibility of all computers being completely different. And another one that I will talk about, I do talk about quite in the new book, is computers that are constructed radically differently. So in the beginning in the 1930s, a guy called Vladimir Ludyankov in the Soviet Union started building computers that used water instead of electrons. In fact, they kind of predated digital computers. He built computers that were capable of doing mathematical calculation, and very complex mathematical calculation, more complex than any other machines or people could do at the time, like very complex differential equations. He was actually working on the temperature of concrete when building railways in Siberia, which is a hard problem. But his computer used tubes of water, many hundreds, thousands of tubes of water, and the way that the water fed through those tubes allowed him to do these very complex calculations. And computers like that were actually in use in Soviet Union until the 1990s, until a particular other types of supercomputers became possible, and they were capable of doing things that computers weren't. And finally, we're starting to learn right now that actually a huge number of ecological systems are capable of doing computation as well. We're discovering all types of, like, for example, weird algae and fungi and these things called slime molds. Have a Google of slime molds and see what they're up to. They're capable of doing certain types of calculation that none of our computers are capable of doing. So there are, like, the type of computers we have in the present moment, all our computers are only one tiny slice of what computers could be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's this huge kind of field that's opening up to us as being a kind of possibility of doing things differently. So this particular version of history, and therefore the future that we have, is not inevitable. It's the result of a series of often unconscious choices made throughout history, but it is available at the moment's notice to kind of switch track, and to turn out very, very differently indeed.
Yeah. God bless the footnotes. Indeed, it's incredible to know about, and I think we're really right at the end. Thank you, James, so much. Your new book comes out in June. Did you
Yes,
say
I've pitched that. It's called Ways of Being, and it'll be out in the US in June next year.
Fabulous.
So yeah, if you find New Dark Age particularly terrifying and hard going, there's that, like, perhaps.
Yes. Well, I'll certainly be looking closely for it. I should mention as well, folks who are with us still, before you depart, consider getting a copy of New Dark Age. You can do so at a beloved local institution here, Old Firehouse Books. You can do so in Wolverine Farm, where I will throw the copies at you, essentially. And then I just want to mention the Book Fest continues this afternoon. So do check the schedule and follow up this expansive discussion as you will, and then also fill out surveys that help us proffer these conversations in the future, for the library and for libraries everywhere. James, again, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Of course.